Welcome, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good night. Welcome to this second lecture of the America-Europe Fund. So this is the second high-level transatlantic lecture, which we are organizing in the context of the America-Europe Fund. And this lecture will focus on trade relations between the European Union and the United States, and is titled Working with Allies. Can the EU and US get their own trade? Please allow me to first say something about the new America-Europe Fund at KU Leuven, which is coordinated by the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. Why was the fund created? The overall aim of the fund is to contribute to a better comparative knowledge and understanding of and stronger mutual relations between the United States and the European Union, including Belgium as the center of the European institutions and NATO. To this end, the fund promotes academic research and exchange on a number of topics, and it's aimed at strengthening comparative knowledge of American and European societies. The fund also initiates cooperation and exchanges between the US, the EU, Belgium, and its regions in the fields of education, science, business, culture, diplomacy, and policy making. In its own, the America-Europe Fund supports the clear strategic choice and the substantially increased internationalization ambitions of the University of Leuven vis-à-vis North America. One of the ways to which we want to achieve the aim of fostering mutual understanding is through a transatlantic lecture, as we have tonight. The concept of this lecture series is one of dialogue between a distinguished American and European speaker, to see how both sides look at important challenges, where we can find common ground, and where the perspectives differ. You are most welcome to join the dialogue and feed in questions and suggestions through the chat box of the GoToWebinar tool. We will be able to monitor the chat box and feed in your input. Let me say a few words on the lecture series and the theme of today. The lecture series is deliberately called The United States and the European Union, a New Momentum ? Indeed, Joe Biden's election as President of the United States presents an opportunity to renew the transatlantic relationship. An opportunity to renew transatlantic relations applies especially to trade and trade relations. The previous US administration shocked the trade regime. It blocked the multilateral system, it initiated a trade war with China, and, important from a transatlantic perspective, it abruptly stopped the then ongoing negotiations over a very ambitious transatlantic trade and partnership agreement. This agreement did not only intend to lower tariffs and enhance trade, but also aimed to pursue an ambitious agenda on regulatory cooperation, which, in this world increasingly dominated by new technologies and innovations, is of crucial importance. The importance of a strong transatlantic alliance is recognized by the current Commission. The new Commission last month released its plan for the next years, outlining its trade priorities. The document is entitled An Open, Sustainable and Assertive Trade Policy, and underscores the importance the European Union is attaching to not only enhancing trade, but to enhance trade which takes into account European values, norms and standards. This vision extends the pleas made by Charles Michel when he addressed the United Nations General Assembly on 25th of September last year. He noted, more than ever, the European Union is defending the rules-based international and cooperation based on universal values. He then continued in reference to the importance of trade and value-based trade, and he noted, I quote, "We are now developing these values and this open model with greater awareness of our strength, with more realism and perhaps less naivety. We have faith in the virtues of free and open economies, never in protectionism. But access to our large market, the second largest economic zone in the world, and the first in terms of international trade, will no longer be sold off. From now on, we will better enforce the level playing field in a market open to those who respect its standards." The open, sustainable, and assertive trade policy by the Commission underlines this approach, but also understands that this enforcing the level playing field cannot be achieved alone. It therefore notes, and I quote, "For the EU to enhance its influence, it needs to develop a more strategic approach to international regulatory cooperation, in particular in relation to the green and digital transitions." And continues that this cooperation with the United States will be critical to ensuring that new regulations are in line with the values of democratic, open, and inclusive society. As a result, one of the key priorities for the coming years will be to develop a closer transatlantic partnership on the green and digital transformation of our economies. Strengthening this transatlantic partnership in trade will be of key importance for prosperity and innovation. It will have to take place in a challenging context, an environment which is characterized by a changing geopolitical context and the role of China therein. The need to revitalize the multilateral trade regime and the World Trade Organization, which just elected a new Director General. The need to address climate change, the need for a green transition, and should I say it, the need to address COVID-19 and the challenges related to ensuring vaccination for all. The possibilities, opportunities, and limitations of a renewed trade partnership will be discussed today by two leading experts. Chad Bown, Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the renowned Peterson Institute for International Economics, is our speaker for the United States. And Christophe Crombez, Professor in Political Economy at the University of Leuven and Senior Research Scholar at the Freeman-Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, is our speaker from, let's say, the European side. The discussion will be moderated by Kari Otteburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. I wish you all a very interesting debate and lecture. I now hand over to Kari.
Thank you, Axel. I'm delighted to serve as moderator for today's discussion. As Axel mentioned, a key aim of this lecture series is to foster dialogue, and to this end, we wanted to structure today's discussion around a set of key topics so we can kind of focus. And these topics include multilateral cooperation, COVID vaccine production and distribution, trade relations with China, future trade agreements, and the trade climate nexus. I will introduce each topic in turn as we go along, but we are not limited to these topics, of course. So questions from the audience on these and any other topics are most welcome. You just have to send them through the webinar chat box function at the bottom of the webinar window. Before we head into the topics, let's set the stage, so to speak. I'd like to invite each of the speakers to take about 10 minutes to share their perspectives on the trade strategy of the new administrations, including on how these administrations differ from previous ones. I propose we start with the newer of the two administrations first and begin with Chad on the Biden administration's trade strategy. Then we can turn to Christophe on the von der Leyen Commission. Chad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for the invitation and the opportunity to be with you. Okay, so my job is to explain what's going on here in the United States. So I'm physically just down the street from the White House in Washington, D.C. I think to understand a little bit about what the Biden administration is thinking and what their approach is going to be, we actually need to go back and understand what the Trump administration did. And so let me just take a moment or two to kind of remind us of where we were not that long ago, even though maybe a lot of us have tried to block it out of our minds, especially on trade. So President Trump, unlike most candidates, actually ran on trade and immigration, but on trade as a platform in 2016 in the presidential election. And when he was elected, he didn't do everything that he promised to do on trade, but he did a lot of it. And so what are some of the things that he did? Well, his first day in office, he withdrew the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP, the mega regional agreement that the United States had pioneered and negotiated, and which largely reflected America's preferences for new rules in the Asia Pacific region. Was a huge undertaking to get there, pulled us out. Now, to Axel's question or comment about Trump pulling the plug on TTIP, the US-EU, I'd probably be a little bit more hesitant there. My sense, talking to American policymakers and negotiators and even former US Trade Representative Mike Froman, is that when the Obama administration left office, it was pretty clear that agreement was nowhere close. And they had made last minute, kind of overtures to the commission in April, September of 2016, but they were still a world away apart. There was just not the appetite to do the deal as beneficial as it might be. So I'm not sure we were ever close there. And of all the bad things the Trump administration did on trade, I think failing to get TTIP across the finish line is probably the least egregious of all of them. But what they did do, pull the United States out of TPP, tariffs on steel and aluminum from everybody, and that affected mostly economic and military allies. These were done under the guise of protecting America's national security under this national security law. And the reason there is, even though the underlying problem or the challenge is steel overcapacity happening elsewhere, and primarily in countries like China, the United States had already stopped imports from China coming in directly. And so the imports of steel that were coming in were largely coming in from Europe, from Canada, from Japan, South Korea. It's largely because steel is, in many respects, a commodity. So even though you shut the stuff coming in from China directly out of your market, low prices still come in and affect, and trade is affecting the domestic industry from alternative sources. So lots of tariffs there, no resolution to the underlying challenges, which is steel overcapacity in the Chinese system. They also ripped up NAFTA, threatened to impose tariffs on Mexico. We sometimes forget about this one, but there was a stage in June of 2018, I think, when the administration threatened 25% tariffs on Mexico for no trade-related reasons, but for migration-related reasons, worried about migrants coming over the border. There was this constant threat of tariffs on European autos that we might remember as well. And then obviously we have the trade war with China. We still have, tariffs on nearly 2/3 of what we import from China. Average tariffs have gone from 3% to over 19%. And that's the new normal. Despite this phase 1 agreement with China, the trade relationship between the United States and China are fundamentally different. And then, killing off WTO dispute settlement, et cetera. So the Trump administration did a number of things on trade, in many respects, fulfilling the candidate Trump's promise on the campaign trail about what his strategy was going to be. So the Biden administration, President Biden wins the election in November. And the first priority that he essentially says is, look, trade is not going to be a priority. That's the first thing that everybody needs to know. The rest of the world says, yay, United States is back. We have so much work to do on trade. But the administration is saying that is not going to be our focus. We are going to focus on fixing the American economy. So they just passed, this $1.9 trillion package to kind of rescue the American economy. We need to handle the public health impacts of the pandemic, which is killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, given how poorly the public health response was last year. And so they're focused on rolling out vaccines, right? Their next plan is a big spending piece of legislation on infrastructure. We have problems with immigration. They want to fix social policy, social inequality, injustice, and obviously climate, right? There's a lot of appetite to do important things to address climate in ways that have been neglected over the last 4 years. So there's a huge laundry list, agenda set of items long before you get to trade. So trade, unfortunately, for people like me, the way I like to put it is the administration's strategy seems to be to make trade boring again. Now, in some respects, I think that's probably a path for progress. We saw with the Trump administration, having trade in the headlines every day is both exhausting, but also not particularly productive when it comes to actually making progress on very important issues. So that's first priority for the new administration. The new U.S. administration is to just kind of take trade off the front page as an agenda item. The second priority, I would say, and where they're going to actually put their emphasis when they do address it, is to work with allies. And this was something the Trump administration really was not all that interested in pursuing, right? Their approach was to essentially start a trade fight with everyone. The only country that was mostly left off the hook through the 4 years was Japan, though there were threats that they would get hit with auto tariffs as well. But essentially, the Trump administration had no friends when it came to trade. And the Biden administration has said that they're going to look at things differently, including working with allies, and especially focusing on the major trade concern and the major concern of the United States geostrategically, which is China. So maybe let me, in my last minute or two of opening, just kind of lay out the groundwork for where we are on US-China relations, because I think these are critical, because everything in the trade space, at least from the United States' perspective, you can trace it back to China. Any topic you can think of, the underlying something that's there, it has got a China piece to it. So we've got this trade war. As I said, all the tariffs are still in place. We have this phase 1 agreement that went into effect a year ago. There's not much there in terms of new trade rules. There's a little bit on China opening up for financial services liberalization, some commitments to improve intellectual property, stop doing some of the forcible transfer of technology that had been worrisome, but nothing on the substantive issues of industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, China not being a market economy, that kind of stuff. China agreed to purchase an additional $200 billion of American exports over last year and this year, 2020 and 2021. But one of the things that I do in my life is to track data. And it's pretty clear from the data that China's nowhere close to making those purchase commitments. The Trump administration was very focused on trying to reduce the bilateral trade deficit with China. And they thought if we can just get China to agree to make all these purchases, that'll help that. It hasn't worked. It's not that that should be a policy goal in the first place, but even if it were, it didn't work. So clearly on the US side, going at it alone with this huge priority of dealing with China wasn't an effective strategy. On the European side, and I'll let Christophe get into the details, I think we're seeing some evidence of a similar sort of story, right? Europeans went off and negotiated this new bilateral investment treaty, Kari, with China. But when you look at the details of it, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of there either, which I think, and we had Sabine Bown, the Director General for Trade, on the podcast that I do about a month ago, and she basically said, yeah, we have nothing in there on industrial subsidies. The only way we're going to make progress on these kinds of topics is working together. And so I think that's the big thing that both the US administration and obviously the Commission has signaled they want to do, is to work together. Now, we just saw signs of what that actually might mean yesterday. We saw these Magnitsky Act sanctions that got imposed on China in a coordinated fashion. Amazingly, for the first time, the United States has been sanctioning China on forced labor issues, the Uyghurs, for over a year now in certain respects, including import bans on certain products. But they led a coordinated effort yesterday to do even more with the EU, Canada, and the UK. So we'll see. And we'll get into the weeds of, on the trade, more traditional trade side, what that might actually mean. But I think there's at least some evidence that working with allies may actually be a strategy that they can try and pull off.
Thank you for this. Christophe, would you do the same on the von der Leyen Commission?
I will try to. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that unlike Chad, I'm actually not a trade economist. I'm an economist, but my main focus is not on trade. Axel was nice enough to introduce me as an expert, which I, of course, am very thankful for. But basically, I read a lot about trade. I write every once in a while. I write about trade and about specifically about EU trade. but I'm really a political economist. So I study political institutions, how they function, how institutions have an impact on policy, basically. So that will also be reflected in my comments, in my introductory comments that will probably be a little bit broader than just focused on trade. So it will be a little bit maybe looking at the bigger picture. I do want to point out one thing, since Chad didn't do it himself. Chad is advertising for the trade talks that he organizes. I would recommend anybody who is interested in international trade to check those out. They're great podcasts that you can watch about all the important topics in trade today. I myself like listening to them very much as well. So what would I say about the prospects for change in the transatlantic relations, and specifically then the trade relations? Are they going to change? Is it going to be much different? Well, I would sort of, I was going to start out pointing out, just like Chad, that maybe we forget very quickly how things were just a few months ago. We try to sort of push that aside and try to get back to normal. But if you ask me, are things going to be different, and are things going to be different as far as trade is concerned, I would just say, well, yeah, I mean, if we look at the past 4 years, without wanting to be too dramatic, and I don't have the reputation of being very dramatic. Most people say that I always remain calm, even when I don't feel like I'm being very calm. But if we look at the past 4 years and what was basically at stake, then I would say that at the last election, what was really on the ballot was the survival of democracy in the United States, and by extension in much of the rest of the world, because if we had re-elected, if the United States had re-elected Donald Trump, the quality of democracy would definitely have gone down quite a bit, if it had survived at all in the United States. At least, I mean, I said definitely, very likely. And that would also have had an impact, not having the support of the United States to fight for democracy throughout the world. That would also have had an impact in the rest of the world. Not only our democracy, but also our free market system and our free trade system. Trump had made it very clear all the way in his campaign in 2016 that he was not a big fan of free trade, and he had already made it clear that he was going to follow up on his promises. He did, as Chad pointed out, with respect to China and on some other issues, on the NAFTA agreement and so on. So we could have expected, if Trump had been re-elected, that he would have continued the erosion of the free trade system, the international trade system that the United States had put in place with its European allies and some other allies as well. And transatlantic cooperation had suffered quite a bit in the 4 Trump years, and would probably have continued to break down, not only as far as trade is concerned, but also on security issues and other issues. So that is the situation that we were in November last year. So did the election in the United States matter? I would say yes. We are not there, and the situation is much different today. On the European side, I would say, okay, there's a new administration, or at least it's been there now for almost for a year and a half almost now. There, the differences, of course, are not as big. There's some different accents that are being laid out, and Axel mentioned them already, but there's not such a clear break in policy compared to the previous administration. Now, does the fact that we had this big change in the US, and this important change in administrations, does that mean that suddenly everything is going to go so much better as far as transatlantic relations are concerned, as far as trade relations are concerned? I would be quite hesitant to say that. I would say, yes, things will be better. The atmosphere will be quite better. There will also be talk about new trade agreements and the importance of cooperation and multilateralism, the WTO, and so on. But on the other hand, there are a number of things that, number of developments that go back way further than Trump, some of them, some of them more recent, that make it more difficult to really change a lot. First, I would say that on both sides of the Atlantic, free trade is not really very popular these days. And that is something that predates Trump coming to power. As Chad also discussed, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that was discussed under the Obama administration and under the that started under the commission that preceded the Juncker Commission, so under Barroso, and when Karel de Gucht, the Belgian trade commissioner, was in charge of the negotiations, that those negotiations didn't really go anywhere. Okay, there was progress, but they went on for years, and most people would have thought in the beginning, okay, at some point before the end of the Obama administration, before the end of Karel de Gucht's term, we'll come to some kind of an agreement or close to it, but that did not happen. Part of it is because of the fact that on both sides of the Atlantic, free trade is not very popular. That's especially true on the extremes, on the two ends of the political spectrum, on the left and the right. It's not limited to the right, it's also the case on the left. If you look at Bernie Sanders or people like that in the United States. And okay, President Biden is somebody who's quite a centrist, you could say, but he is under pressure also from people on the left wing of his party who are not big fans of free trade. The same can be said about Europe, and we don't need to look any further than Belgium. People will remember, no doubt, that when the the agreement with Canada, the free trade agreement with Canada was going through its approval process, ratification process, that the Socialist Party in the French part of the country created quite a bit of trouble in that respect. And the same can be said about parties, left-wing parties throughout the rest of Europe. So free trade was not very popular, is not very popular today. So I would say that is one reason why we should not expect suddenly that there will be a new big trade agreement and so on. A second reason I would say is that it's a bit in line with what Chad was saying also, and maybe Chad made it even made a related point that makes it even more difficult to make a lot more progress. Chad was saying the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, is not really focused on trade, and of course that is true. The point that I would like to make, and Chad also mentioned that, would be that even if there is a focus on trade, the main focus of the United States is not on Europe. There are other concerns. Okay, there are China, other trade relations, and Europe, maybe naively in the past, that's at least something I've noticed in the past 10, 20 years or so, that Europe still likes to think of itself as a more important partner of the United States than the United States thinks of Europe. Now, of course, in Europe, people then always point at the fact that the trade relationship between the EU and the US is still the most important in the world, and that, of course, has truth to it. But for whatever reason, the focus doesn't lie primarily with Europe, and sometimes Europeans tend to forget that. So that also makes new agreements with Europe not really something that is going to happen anytime soon. And then a third element, of course, is also what you already mentioned before, is the whole COVID situation also, I think, makes it more difficult to make a lot of progress very quickly. For two reasons, I would say. The focus is not with trade these days. The focus is with solving the current ongoing pandemic. And on the other hand, on top of that, the COVID problems actually have trade aspects, as you already mentioned, and we will probably talk a little bit about that later in this lecture. And that basically doesn't those trade aspects of COVID are not of that nature that they will facilitate relations between the US and the EU, I think. So I think for a number of reasons, I would not expect any big dramatic changes anytime soon. Now, what are the priorities in Europe, and where can we expect some progress? I would say my remarks here are sort of in line with what with Axel and Chad mentioned before. Axel went through the priorities that the European Union outlined, paying more attention to human rights in trade agreements, climate, the digital economy, new trade agreements like TTIP, making work of that, and so on. I think some of these are actually areas where progress could be made. China, Chad mentioned China quite a bit, focused on that quite a bit in the end. The parallels are there, as he pointed out also, and that has become even clearer just in the last 24 or 48 hours with the mutual expulsions and so on, that even put into question whether the agreement that China and the EU signed or agreed to at the end of last year, whether that will ever really be implemented. So I think that's definitely an area where the US and the EU could work together, and both claim that they want to work together and could make some progress, or would at least be in a stronger position than they are when they just go about it by themselves. I also think, of course, climate in that area, I think there's going to be quite a significant change just because the administration in the US changed and has very different climate-related objectives than the Trump administration did, very much more in line with what Europe says it wants to achieve. So I think that would also be an area where a lot of progress could be made. I also think that once the immediate sort of the rivalry between different countries to get vaccines, and different countries sort of in North America and in Western Europe, when everybody sort of gotten vaccinated, that they could work together there also to make sure that vaccines are properly distributed throughout the rest of the world. So I think those are some areas where progress can be made based on the priorities of both administrations. I'm not quite sure how long exactly I talked, but this is sort of where I would leave it.
That's wonderful. Thank you. We actually covered a lot of ground in 20 minutes, so that was great. And we'll have a chance to return to many of these topics throughout the rest of this discussion, so we can keep getting back to some of these things that you have brought up. So now, as we go into the individual topics, I would propose that each speaker takes 5 minutes to briefly address the question, and we'll trade off answering the question, and then we'll move on to the next ones. And the audience is very welcome to start sending questions in at any point. So to start, I would like to start off with multilateralism and the World Trade Organization, and I would invite each of your thoughts on the EU and the US approach to multilateral cooperation, obviously, especially at the World Trade Organization. In particular, perhaps each of you can start by addressing what the new administrations face and what they might bring to some of the long-term issues at the multilateral level. You already mentioned the dispute settlement, blockage, reform, and the blockage of the appellate body, so we can go into some of those things. And since we started with Chad last time, would it be okay if we start with you, Christophe?
Sure. Yes, so as far as multilateralism is concerned, and specifically the WTO, I would say, well, I mean, for the EU, this has always sort of been the way they like to look at international trade politics. The EU puts a lot more emphasis on multilateralism than the US usually, for understandable reasons. And you could, some people may like to think that that is because the EU is just nicer and wants to include everybody in global conversations and so on. But you could also say that it is a reflection of the EU strength, and the EU is not a superpower. I mean, it's an economic superpower to a large extent, but it's not the most powerful country or set of countries in the world. And it's an area, a continent that is concerned that with demographic evolutions and economic evolutions throughout the world, then in the end, it will sort of, it runs the risk of not being one of the major players, that there's a scenario that is thinkable where the United States and China and maybe some other countries like India or Japan or so basically run the global economic system. So Europe wants multilateralism because it wants to be one of the main players, one of the main 5 or so players that set or that determine trade policy. This is looking forward, sort of in the long run. In that respect, I don't think there's much of a change under this administration compared to the Juncker Commission. The changes that have occurred recently were the result of the Trump administration's hostility towards multilateral institutions in general and the WTO in particular. So I think there the EU is basically probably going to be a willing participant in basically making those institutions work again, and that may involve negotiations with the US or so. My guess is that the US will want some changes in the way that the WTO functions. And I think that at least from the European perspective, that there would be a willingness to get to some compromise and meet the US's wishes to some extent. As far as the US wishes are concerned, I guess Chad is in a better position to talk about that.
All right, shall we turn over to you then, Chad? Sure.
So I think on the WTO stuff, let me take maybe put it into 2 buckets. The first one is probably the more familiar, which is the WTO's appellate body, the dispute settlement system. So the Trump administration, as everybody knows, refused to appoint new judges, new members to the WTO's appellate body, effectively ending the way that we had been, resolving trade disputes over the last 25 years and not replacing it with anything else. And so I think the world sees the Biden administration coming in and saying, they'll quickly reappoint, new WTO appellate body members, and we can have the system again, and that will be great. And I just think that's completely unrealistic, and everybody should disabuse themselves of that notion. And that's basically because, whether I believe it or not is sort of irrelevant, but this is a long-standing issue that the United States has with the decisions that the appellate body has made over the last 15 years. And so the Obama administration complained about the same thing. The Bush administration complained about the same thing before that. And it's essentially that there's certain case classes of decisions that the judges in Geneva were making that were overly constraining what the United States said it agreed to take on in terms of commitments for a specific set of policies. These things are called trade remedies. So anti-dumping, safeguard provisions, countervailing duties, anti-subsidy tariffs. So kind of special kinds of tariffs. When you look at the data, as I'm an economist and want to do, doesn't cover all that much trade. On both sides, you would say, I can't believe you're ending a well-functioning dispute settlement system because of these grievances. But that's sort of where we are. They're politically important for the United States and sort of Congress allowing the United States to go ahead with trade agreements more generally. And the broad idea is, well, when the WTO through these legal decisions has constrained the United States and sort of taken these things away, it really went too far. And so the Biden administration, I don't think, is just going to restore the appellate body to what it was before. The United States is at its sort of maximal point of leverage on this, and they want substantive changes to how the dispute settlement system is ultimately going to work to make sure that what happened, which I think is a legitimate misunderstanding between what the US's expectations were and what either the rest of the world or the WTO dispute settlement jurists thought the expectations were, and that needs to be resolved. And maybe a new system put in place so that when future misunderstandings happen, they can get resolved without the whole system kind of crumbling down. So I think that's one thing, but I don't see that as being tackled anytime soon. It's sort of a big institutional design question that they're going to have to take their time to kind of wrap their heads around. The second, though, is again goes back to China and what the role of China actually is in the WTO. And I think we're kind of waiting and seeing what the what the administration's perspective on this is going to be. Now, to their credit, the one thing that the Trump administration was willing to do with allies, so with the EU and with Japan over the last 3 years, was something called a trilateral initiative, where the ministers would get together periodically, once a quarter or so, and behind the scenes, the worker bees were kind of thinking about how to draft new rules on things like industrial subsidies, the things of joint concern with China. And a year ago, the three countries, or the three partners, the EU, US, and Japan, kind of rolled out a template document to say, look, this is our starting point for what we think potential new rules on industrial subsidies would be. It's hard for the three of them to kind of even come to an agreement between themselves. They're all market economies, but Europe has many more state-owned enterprises that it's worried about might be constrained by some of these new disciplines than perhaps the United States would be. And so even just coming to internal resolution on that issue between the three was tough. The next stage would be, well, what do you do with that next? Do you socialize it with other WTO member countries that are important, potentially try to bring it into the WTO as what they call a plurilateral agreement, an agreement that not everybody would have to sign up to. If you're thinking about sub-Saharan Africa, these disciplines really aren't all that relevant there. But then ultimately, if this is designed to try to attract China or to deal with, constrain China in some ways, how do you get China to sign on? What are you going to give it elsewhere to make it look like it's something that it wants to be a part of? You can't just sort of impose it on China and get it to agree. So I think that's sort of where we are, right? Is that a path? Is the WTO a path to kind of implement those kinds of rules changes as well? So there's lots to do with the WTO, but I think those are probably the two the biggest issues, I think, from the United States' side at this moment.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions from the audience, but we'll take one for now because the other ones fit more with some of the other topics. So we have a question from Nino Parsadanishvili, who is asking about new trade negotiations at the WTO level and whether we think that the newly elected Director General will have an impact on the stalled negotiations, and how the EU and US, as members of the WTO, might what their approach might be in terms of helping the WTO in tackling poverty eradication and the inclusion of labor rights in its agenda. So if either of you wants to take that, or both of you want to take that, that's totally fine. Just let me know.
I'll give it so we had new WTO Director General Ngozi installed, and she is kind of amazing and maybe uniquely situated for this moment in time. That being said, she has a huge task ahead of her. So first of all, I think you have to recognize that she has limited powers. The WTO is a member-driven organization, and she kind of has convening powers, but she just can't make things happen out of her own sheer effort and will. The WTO has a huge built-in agenda, so quite separately from the things that I mentioned before on the WTO appellate body and thinking about concerns over China, it's got fisheries negotiations that have been going on for a long time. It's got negotiations over investment facilitation, e-commerce, so digital stuff that are all sort of there in the background that you go to Geneva and the Geneva folks are very much concerned about. But the biggest one at the moment that's probably going to be the litmus test for whether they can do anything at all is going to be on the pandemic and vaccines. And so we have these proposals put forward by India, South Africa, now co-sponsored by a group of African countries, suggesting that what we really need to do is to eliminate intellectual property rights protection on COVID-related products, and that's going to help us get out of the pandemic. And the richer countries are saying it's A, a non-starter, and B, it's not really going to help. If there's particular products issues that you're having, we already have provisions in the TRIPS agreement on compulsory licensing, where you can demand that you have the ability to produce these things domestically in your economy. That's not really the constraint at the moment on getting everybody vaccinated. So this is something that she's going to have to deal with, this divide that's there already. Now she comes into this job as an incredibly accomplished African. So she has hopefully, credibility with much of the developing membership of the WTO from kind of her background and experience that many potentially other director generals might not. She was on the chair of the board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. So she understands vaccines and how they're just a unique product, and not everybody in the world is going to be able to manufacture these things. And so it's primarily going to be through trade that ultimately we get the world vaccinated once we get there. But it's going to be a tough road to hoe. And as Christophe mentioned, we are in a world right now where it's only the rich countries that are getting vaccinated at all. We're still fighting between ourselves for the limited doses that we have. And the rest of the world, the developing world, is sitting on the sidelines saying, I can't believe you guys are doing this. So the WTO has a huge agenda ahead of it. The new director general is uniquely positioned to kind of lead us, but it's going to be tough. And it's probably going to take a while to get to those agenda items as well.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Christophe?
I would just maybe add that, Chad pointed out that the WTO has a lot of other issues that are more pressing for the WTO at this point. And I would say, consistent with what we both said earlier, also for the US and Europe, unfortunately, these are not the top priorities. Maybe there will be a lot of lip service paid to the problems that developing countries face, also with respect to COVID. But at this point, at least, those are not the top priorities of policy makers here.
Thank you. Since COVID and vaccination has come up a few times, why don't we move on to the topic of a COVID vaccine production and manufacturing? I know Chad has advocated for a COVID-19 vaccine investment and trade agreement, or at least I've seen something along these lines, to increase global vaccine production. Perhaps you could start off by sharing some of the key points of your argument for such an agreement, and we could start there.
Yeah, so thank you. So like everybody, I've spent far too much of my life thinking about and learning about vaccines over the last couple of months. And I've been very lucky in the sense that I've been able to learn from experts and talk to people in the industry. And essentially, this is what I've learned. It's super complicated. There's only a handful of countries, companies in the world that can do this. The United States, when I went back and reviewed what had happened last year in 2020 and how we got to this point. So I guess, first of all, we should say that, where we are in terms of the scientists having invented vaccines, gotten them passed through clinical trials, gotten them manufactured at any commercial scale as quickly as it did is sort of, unanticipated, unexpected human feat. And so it's amazing in a positive side that we have gotten where we are as quickly as we have. And when you review how that happened in the United States, it was essentially, that the U.S. government, and as much as I complain about the Trump administration for about everything else, their strategy on vaccines, on its face at least, looks very, very good. And they threw essentially a ton of money at a number of different places, and that includes the vaccine companies, the sponsors, so the Pfizers, the Modernas, the AstraZenecas, the Johnson & Johnson, all of the ones you would have heard of, to kind of develop and do the clinical trials and all that. But then the phases of the manufacturing process as well, setting up the sites in advance and reserving them to make sure that they could be manufactured at scale as soon as they were authorized to do so. So not only that, but then also scaling up all of the inputs that you need. So making sure there's going to be enough of the specialized raw materials, the specialized pieces of capital equipment, so these bioreactors and things like that. You need, their estimates, we might need 8 billion doses of these vaccines this year. And in any given year for vaccines, you need somewhere between maybe 1.5 billion doses of vaccines for flu and pediatric vaccinations, things like that. So that just means you need more inputs of everything that you could possibly imagine. Well, the Trump administration, through this Operation Warp Speed thing, subsidized a lot of that. The concern is that the rest of the world, we haven't seen that scaling up of inputs yet. And so the argument to kind of get enough vaccines for the rest of the world, it's not as easy as let's just turn over the IP and let everybody who wants to make these things. I think that's, first of all, a bit of a non-starter. Not the regulatory conditions under which they can be made have to be so carefully managed. You only want the best able to do it. But we also are going to need lots and lots of inputs. And the challenge is that the places where the inputs are going to be made aren't necessarily the same places where the vaccines are going to be manufactured. And so there you're going to need trade to make those things happen, but you're going to kind of need also a coordinated reaction of subsidization. So I'm only going to be willing to subsidize the inputs if I'm one government, if I'm going to be sure at the end of the day that I'm going to have access to the outputs, right? Access to the vaccines through trade. So this is where you need to have an agreement, a binding agreement that's actually going to allow this to happen. And we're seeing right now what's going on within Europe, these cross-border supply chains, that even the existing infrastructure that's there is under threat, right? With the concern that the Commission might not only shut off exports of the AstraZeneca vaccine to the UK. Well, what might the UK do in response? Well, the UK, exports some of the key ingredients that, say, the Pfizer, the Moderna vaccines, these lipids that are needed for the mRNA, the newest vaccines, need to be able to go at all. So they could threaten to, cut off the exports of those things, right? And that's sort of the opposite of what we want to have happen. We want to encourage not only the free flow of trade, but everybody kind of scaling up the inputs necessary to be able to contribute to this endeavor. So yeah, so in a piece that I put out at the end of last week, it's calling for not just let's have free trade and all this stuff. Yeah, we need that, but we need actually investment, and it's not just investment facilitation. We actually need coordinated public sector investment in all of the inputs that we're going to need to scale up production as well. Easy to do.
Oh, right. Thanks so much for that. Christophe, I would like to turn to you, but also we have a related question, so maybe you can consider this as well. Regarding the COVID-19 response in the WTO, the EU, USA, and a few others blocked a push by developing nations to waive COVID vaccine patent rights, which would have given manufacturing rights to all. What are your thoughts on this? And this question comes from Shivam Gai. So if you want to respond to that while you respond to the COVID vaccination question.
Okay, I'll first quickly respond to the question asked by the member of the audience, and then I'll return to your broader question. With respect to the question about patents, intellectual property rights for the vaccines used here, I don't know enough about the financial side for the pharmaceutical companies involved in this to know at what point it would make sense from an economic perspective, not from a legal one, to lift these restrictions on production by others. So I am not somebody who thinks that pharmaceutical companies should just give everything away that they do. From an economic perspective, that doesn't make any sense. And of course, this is a very particular situation. At some point, the pharmaceutical companies, of course, will have earned the proper return on their investment, but I don't know enough about the finances of this to know when that would be the case. Of course, the US, the EU governments could compensate pharmaceutical companies for this, but I don't know whether they want to do that. Maybe Chad knows more about that. He can get back to it, I guess. My answer to your broader question about the EU and related to its COVID strategy, the EU gets a lot of criticism these days. Which is maybe, you could say, not very much different from how it is treated in the media on other issues. I, of course, have spent my life so far studying in the EU, and sometimes I feel like I have to come to its defense, even though that's maybe not my role. But I do think that the EU is very bad at PR, and that is also been the case here on this issue. First of all, I would say that the EU, just to start the discussion with a point that I think in this discussion is usually not made, The EU has no authority in all of this. So basically dealing with a health crisis of whatever nature is basically the responsibility of national governments. So if there is anybody to blame for the shortcomings in Europe's response, it is national governments. The British government has done a better job. I think everybody will agree with that, at least with the vaccination side of handling the pandemic, maybe not with the handling the pandemic itself, but with the vaccination side. But it started that approach in 2020 when it was still bound by EU internal market rules, just like any other European country. Other European countries at that time in November could have done the same thing that the United Kingdom did. So in a way, I think that when I make that point, because I think to some extent the problems that the EU is dealing with now are the result of the fact that the EU as sort of an integrated institution is sort of an incomplete organization. The process towards integration has not come to fulfillment, to its final fulfillment. It's a work in progress, and you have an organization, the European Union, specifically the European Commission, that has some authorities that countries give powers to, that in this case it didn't necessarily need to have, but it only can do so much. And one important aspect of the whole vaccination process that Chad also mentioned, and that gets a lot of attention in the media, is a financial side. The European Union didn't spend enough money in the development process, in the trial process, and so on. That's probably true. But if you look at the European Union and its budget, it has a budget of 1% of GDP. And on top of that, when they want to spend some, when they discuss about how big should our budget be in the next few years, you have a lot of reluctance, especially from Northern European countries and the Frugal Four and others. People are very reluctant to give the EU more money. And so that is sort of something that hinders the EU in really setting up a coherent strategy to deal with this. Of course, you could say, well, that's just an excuse. I mean, the countries could do it themselves, but that's exactly the point. If France, Germany, Italy, also smaller countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, and so had wanted to invest more money in this, and they could have done it on their own or jointly, or they could have asked the European Commission to do it, but they didn't. So I think that's one problem. The fact that the European Union is not really a federal government in the same way that the federal government is in the United States. It has a lot of powers, especially on the main issue that we talk about today, on trade. But in other areas like handling a health crisis, it doesn't have all that much power, and it sort of has to improvise. I mean, it gets some powers from the member states on an ad hoc basis, but then it doesn't really have the funding to really set up a coherent strategy. Another point I would say is that you could say that the EU has been naive, and that the UK and the US basically were better, you could say, at negotiating contracts that basically required that the production in their respective countries would stay there. The EU, as you know, has, as opposed to the UK and the EU, has exported a lot of vaccines to countries throughout the world, and not just to the United Kingdom, but also elsewhere, to Canada also, for example. And that is something that the US and UK are not doing, and the US has even gone as far as to prohibit AstraZeneca from exporting some of the excess vaccines that were not being used in the United States, because it's not been approved yet here, to export them to the European Union. I'm saying that because that sort of relates also to my point of PR. It's kind of hard to imagine that the one set of countries that is in the Western world, at least, that is exporting a lot of vaccines, that is basically also the country that gets criticized in the press for its attitude towards exports. And not only in the UK press, but when I read, for example, the Belgian press, Belgium has a reputation of being pro-EU, but what I read in the press and from analysts who no doubt know way more about it than I do, it's very negative about the EU. So a big PR problem there, I think. Now, I think another important aspect is the rollout of the whole vaccination process, but that is handled by the member states. And we had a little chat before we started our presentation today. But in Belgium, I mean, the way this is handled in Belgium, I think it's just unbelievable. And I can actually believe it because I know how Belgian bureaucracy works. But if you see that, I don't know, over a weekend, maybe 100 people in Belgium get a vaccine on 2 of the 7 days of the week, how are you going to make much progress in a scenario like that? The constraint is clearly not in Belgium the number of vaccines that have been received, because there are a lot of vaccines that are just sitting around because the government cannot, or the governments cannot get their act together, administrating it fast enough. I was just reading this morning also on Twitter, one of my colleagues in the Netherlands is reporting basically the same thing. In the United States, people in the education sector who are my age, they have been vaccinated, or at least they're very close to getting vaccinated. Whereas in a country like Belgium, people in their 80s, like my dad, who needs heart surgery next month, they haven't even received a letter of invitation. That is not the responsibility of the European Union. That is a mismanagement at the national level or at lower levels. And I think there, what we see when we compare the US to the EU is that very often in situations like that, the EU is hindered by the fact that it's more bureaucratic very often, and the US is better at reacting to crises, to new developments. I think I've talked too long about this, and I come across probably as a defender of the European Union, but I just wanted to shed some light that I often do not see shed in this discussion.
It's much appreciated. Thank you very much. Maybe we can return to this discussion at the end because we're already getting some questions for our next topic, and I will keep us moving for now, but we can come back to COVID, and it has obviously launched a big discussion, so I think it would be great if we can return to that. Unless you wanted to add one more thing, Chad, a response? Okay, great. So we'll move on then to trade relations between the EU and China and the US and China. For Chad, if you could touch on how you see the trade war with China evolving, and for Christophe, if you could share some thoughts and insights on the new EU-China investment agreement. And for both of you, something to think about is how will the different strategies towards China influence the relationship between the EU and the US? And we actually have a question from the audience that I'll add to that from Sichi Zhao, who says, who asks, how do you see, what concrete steps and actions can be taken right now with regard to EU and US cooperation on addressing the China issue? Yeah, put that in quotes. Chad, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so I think on US-China, we probably shouldn't expect much of a reversal of the Trump administration's policies for the following reason. I think China now, for better or worse in the United States, is a bipartisan issue. You know, if you're Republican on the far right, it may be for defense, you know, geostrategic, military reasons that you're worried about China. If you're a progressive on the left, it's, you know, human rights and labor and environment. But you put that together, and there's just a lot of anti-China. So there isn't a sense in which the Biden administration is going to essentially reverse the Trump administration's policies. I think the big question is whether or not there's a change in the rest of the world in sort of the willingness to go along with the United States. And so I'll be interested to hear, obviously, what Christophe's thoughts are on that. Let me just maybe shed a little bit more granularity and light on some of the issues, though, that are coming up and where international cooperation is probably needed. So obviously the tariffs strategy, the United States going alone has costs, right? Because essentially during the trade war, China just lowered its tariffs toward everybody else and kind of made it more attractive for exporters in Europe or Japan to get access into the Chinese market. And so by the United States going alone, it not only didn't accomplish much, but it, in some sense, in economic terms, may have helped cement the economic interests of other countries getting sort of even more embedded within China. So that's one. The other area that's of interest, though, that's still emerging is on technology, right? And so, the one that I have in the world, I think, has been focused on over the last year and a half has been on semiconductors. This started off from the US perspective, more to do with 5G and telecommunications and concerns with Huawei, right? The giant Chinese telecommunications hardware provider, providing base stations and cell phone towers and things like that were going to create the 5G infrastructure for the future that's going to allow us all to do amazing Internet of Things and be connected all the time, that kind of thing. The United States has big problems historically with this Chinese company, and basically used their access to American semiconductors as a way to try to kill it off. So semiconductors are a critical input that a company like Huawei needs to be able to make their stuff. The United States, we don't have a national champion in this product space. The only other main competitors of Huawei are, European, so Nokia and Ericsson, and then Samsung a little bit coming out of South Korea. So the United States, we don't have anybody to subsidize, but what we do have are inputs that we could cut off going to the company to try to kill them off that way. And so that was the strategy, export controls. But once the policymakers in the United States, on one hand, it didn't work initially because the United States, a lot of its semiconductors, even American semiconductors, aren't actually manufactured in the United States. So they're manufactured in Asia or maybe even in Europe. And so in order to get export controls to work, you had to actually coordinate with allies, with trading partners on this. Either that or implement additional sets of export controls, which is what they did. They didn't coordinate policy with allies. What they did is they said, well, the other companies that make semiconductors, whether it's in Taiwan or South Korea or Europe, what do they all need to be able to make their semiconductors? They need other pieces of American equipment that we tend to have monopoly power over. And so they threatened to cut those off and say, basically, if anybody in the world wants to sell stuff to this Chinese company, you can't and rely on American inputs, right? So this is how things have proceeded. The American policymakers have seen this maybe to have worked and are continuing now to ramp up these sorts of export controls more generally with respect to China. But in order to do this in a way that doesn't end up really hurting the American industry, because, I forget the current numbers, but it's something like 1/3 of all semiconductors in the world are consumed within China because it has all the electronics assembly for TVs and computers, all this kind of stuff. You have to coordinate with allies, and there's just no infrastructure set up to do this. We don't have a sort of multilateral export control regime for these kind of dual use items in a way that's set up to deal with this. So one of the interesting things that's come out of the commission is this proposal for a trade and technology council, right? Which may be a way to kind of coordinate not only on trade with respect to China, but also on export controls and sensitive technologies as well. And so that's an area of, a potential alliance, but there you're going to have kind of competing commercial interests that are going to make it challenging as well. So I'll throw all that stuff out there on the table and see if maybe Christophe has a reaction to how to get us through that morass.
Okay, Christophe, would you like to take the mic?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that in this area, I would think, but it could be my that I'm wrong. This is my personal opinion, but I do think that in this area there's some prospect for closer cooperation and for the following reasons. I mean, there are, as Chad points out, there are competing commercial interests in a number of areas. But I think if you look at the bigger picture in transatlantic relations, I think that that for Europe, it's sort of setting out its own policy with respect to China, a policy that is may be disliked by the United States, is not its first priority. So in other words, I tend to think, but I may be wrong, that that basically Europe may sort of think of this as sort of a price to pay for a better transatlantic relationship. I may be wrong about this. Maybe some people would say that I'm completely off, but I think that there's some opportunity there. Some other reasons why I think that is that for, as Chad pointed out, just like in the United States, when you think about relations with China, there are people who pay more attention to the economic side. Some more people think more about it in security terms. And I would say on the right in Europe, people who are also in general more pro-free trade, they will also typically pay they attach more importance to the relationship with the United States. So they may be more inclined to work together with with the US on this issue. Whereas on the left, they may not necessarily like this, but they are more concerned, as you can see also today in the reaction to what happened yesterday. They are more concerned about human rights related issues. They are not all that happy about all kinds of recent free trade agreements that the European Union signed, not only with China, not only the agreement with China that we were just talking about, but other agreements that with Canada and other countries. So they could also be inclined to take a different stance toward China. So I think for these reasons, I think this could be one of the areas where some progress could be made, and the US and the EU could work together. But just on a side note in this respect, I mentioned a couple of times that I may be wrong. One of the consequences of the pandemic, I think, is that I mean, it's kind of easy to stay in touch in the way that we are staying in touch today, and to attend seminars and workshops all over the world. But there is something that gets lost by not having person-to-person contact, and one of them is that you find out things that you would otherwise not find out just by running into people or so, by being in Brussels or so, and chatting with people who are sort of part of that bubble. Chad was pointing out, I think in the beginning also, that he's just down the street from the White House. The reason why the Peterson Institute is there, I guess, is also because there's a lot of government officials and so in that area, and it's easy to communicate with them, and you get something out of that direct contact. So that is a little bit missing, I think, these days. Definitely in Europe, where the lockdown is a bit more stricter, and it may also be that as a result of that, people are just worse, not as well informed, including I myself.
Thank you so much. We have some more questions on this, but again, I think we should move on to the rest of the topics so we can get through them, and then we can come back to some of these audience questions in the end. So our next topic is future trade agreements. And so I'm hoping that each of you can weigh in on each trade power's particular priorities in terms of negotiating new trade agreements, or in the case of the US, for joining an existing one like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And also the likelihood of reactivating the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And in case of reactivating this agreement, which you already referenced obviously in the introduction, do you expect it to pick up where it was left off, which you said was a bit kind of dead in the water? Or do you expect a new approach? And if so, in which ways? And let's start with Christophe this time, if you don't mind.
All right, in terms of new trade agreements and reviving TTIP, I'm not the most optimistic person in that area. I mean, we mentioned a few times already that trade is not a priority. International trade, it's not for Biden. It's not much for EU's policymakers these days. The attitude towards free trade is also not all that positive. Also in the Democratic Party, not just on the Republican side in the United States. So that's maybe reasons to be not too optimistic in that respect. On the other hand, I mean, people have said, but people said it at the beginning of the TTIP negotiations also, well, these are the easiest trade negotiations there are. And it was a point that some people made. The tariffs are already negligible. The US doesn't have to fear too much competition from the EU and vice versa, because labor costs are relatively similar, at least if you compare to other countries like China or other countries in Asia. So it should be relatively easy to have a trade agreement, but that's what people said. What is it now? 10 years ago, or I actually forgot how long exactly. So I'm not the most optimistic person, but maybe Chad is more optimistic. Who knows?
No, I mean, I'm much the same thing. I mean, the Biden administration said not a priority. And I think that makes sense. I mean, they're hugely costly politically in terms of what you have to spend in political capital to get them through Congress. So no, I mean, I think to your point, you know, TTIP was all about the regulatory coherence stuff, right? So getting the regulators in Washington and getting the regulators in Brussels and elsewhere around Europe on the same page. But all the stuff that could kind of happen naturally through market, you know, economic mechanisms already happen. So the only things that you're left with are the super complicated things where, you know, folks have dug their heels in. This is how we do our, you know, clinical trials. This is how we regulate chemicals, and there's a lot of vested interest there, and it's hard to wind those back. So I think that's where the gains are to be made, but that's a slog, and that's really kind of setting up an infrastructure for long-term engagement in dialogue, which, you know, not a quick big bang trade agreement, which is what politicians typically like to see.
Great, thanks a lot. So we actually have a couple of questions about this, which I might just feed in here. One asking about a bunch of, like, would it be possible to do then these smaller trade agreements? Do you think that there's scope for that between the two, especially as the economy starts to pick up? And that question comes from Dirk Wouters. And then we also have a question on, actually, let's just go with that one for now. And we can pick up the next ones in the Q&A. Did someone want to take that?
Yeah, I'll start with that. So to be honest, I think that if we're thinking about the future of trade agreements, it probably is these kind of smaller plurilateral kinds of agreements. You know, if we're going to make any progress in the multilateral system, it's probably going to be through smaller groups of countries, and then setting up a framework where other countries can join when they're ready and able. And so whether you're talking about e-commerce, you know, the stuff on industrial subsidies, and part of that is the challenge of working in a, you know, in a universally accepted system where everybody has veto power, right? As we've seen, whether it's India or South Africa, willing to exercise it, you know, even when they don't really have a strong interest at stake in the negotiations. So I think to the question of, you know, so lots of small deals, how do you get each one of those small deals across the line? I think that's the big challenge right now. When I talk to negotiators, they all have in their mind, well, I don't want to bring anything else. I know the issues in fisheries. I know the issues in econ. I just want to let's negotiate just over this thing. And I just don't think that approach, unfortunately, is going to work, because some of those deals are going to create losers within countries or losers of countries that are going to need to have some wins somewhere else to be able to package that together. And so I think the more of these smaller things that you could actually put together as a package, you're more likely to create a scenario where everybody wins something and is willing, and on net, and is willing to therefore sign off on the deal, at least all the major players. So I think collections of small deals, yeah, I think that's the way to go eventually.
Did you have anything you'd like to add to that, Christophe?
I agree with Chad. I would just add one thing. Chad mentioned earlier that in answer to the previous questions that the problems with these agreements, with TTIP, for example, lies with the ratification on both sides of the Atlantic. There are so many veto players that you need to get on your side. In Europe, even you could say it's more complicated, even though speaking, if it's just trade related, it should just be the EU. And then other countries would be obliged to ratify. The member states would be obliged to ratify. But anyway, that those ratification processes are also there for the small agreements. So small agreements are easier to negotiate, but that doesn't necessarily make the ratification more easy. So I would still be a little bit reluctant to think that much is going to happen in that respect.
Thanks a lot. Next, we'll turn to climate and the trade climate nexus. And it is clearly a matter of significant debate. We already have multiple questions from the audience on this exact issue. So the questions generally we have are, what do you expect in terms of addressing climate change in trade policy in the future? Where do the priorities lie? And do you expect a more advanced approach towards climate policy in trade policy, or will it be mostly in reference to commitments like the Paris Agreement? And Chad, would you like to go first on this one?
I mean, we're so far behind in the United States on climate, and so the Biden administration has kind of said all the right things. But you know, I was in the Obama administration in the second year, and so I showed up in, when did I start? So they came into office in January of 2009. I got there in beginning of August 2010, and already the climate discussion was over. The political tide had turned, and kind of the window of opportunity to do something really forward-leaning on climate had passed. So it's just a challenging environment in the United States. We're 10 years beyond that. We'll see. I mean, we have, you know, announcements that even you know, the American Petroleum Institute has said, yeah, we'd be willing to sign up for carbon pricing. And so potentially, I mean, we're just baby steps need to be taken in the United States before we even get to, you know, thinking about additional international engagement on some of this. So, I mean, I know obviously this is huge. If the Biden folks are serious about it, and they have sent the signals, right, by appointing John Kari, you know, this kind of sage elder statesperson as their envoy, they've sent the right signals, and we know that at least rhetorically this is a huge priority for the commission, and so there's possibility to cooperate there, but I think, you know, will it happen? It's kind of hard to predict. I mean, we need carbon pricing in the United States. That would be a huge lift in and of itself. And then thinking about how to set up a border carbon adjustment mechanism in a way that did not lead to a complete unwinding of trade cooperation in other spaces, and you know, just kind of wasn't an excuse for tariffs, which everybody's going to want to love. We'll see. So there's possibly, but I think it needs to start relatively soon, at least on the U.S. side.
Christophe?
Yeah, I would just add one thing. Once again, I would agree with what Chad said. I would just add one thing to that, and maybe a little bit more positive or a bit more optimistic. And that is that if you look at the international side and the potential for international agreements, if you look at the politics of it, there's one important difference in terms of the political landscape compared to pure trade agreements, and that is that at the left side of the political spectrum, that you would have enthusiasm for agreements in this area, which is not usually there or not as much there for trade agreements. So if there were some kind of a trade agreement to be a bit more precise, in the Democratic Party in the US and the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. Well, Bernie Sanders is not really a member of the Democratic Party, but anyway, the left wing of the Democratic Party would be all happy with that, and you would not have the Parti Socialiste in Belgium trying to block the ratification of the agreement. Now, whether that means that that much progress will be made, that's not necessarily the case, of course. It could be that it is largely going to be there will be a lot of rhetoric and a lot of good intentions, but not really much concretely achieved. We'll have to see.
Thank you very much. So now I think I'll turn to some of the questions from the audience, and if you want to bring back any of the other topics, also feel free to do so. So we have a question from Virgo Silema, who's asking about tax cooperation and the effect this might have on the transatlantic trade relations. More precisely, the so-called digital levy. OECD is still aiming for a solution. The US administration has opened up recently, giving up the safe harbor clause, etc. However, the European Commission will be proposing a European digital levy of some kind on its own. Do you have any thoughts on how this could affect trade relations?
So I think it's a huge area, obviously, and Treasury Secretary Yellen did say that they're not going to push on the safe harbor provision. So there's an opportunity for engagement there. But it's essentially, you know, what you're asking of the rest of the world is some of the United States' tax revenue base. You know, that's effectively what they're asking for. It's not as if the GAFA companies aren't being taxed. They're just being taxed in the United States. And the question is whether the United States is going to be, I guess, willing to give that up, and what the model should be. And, you know, if the rest of the world wants to rethink the model of international taxation to allow some of their big multinationals that don't necessarily aren't digital companies, but everybody's a digital company in some sense, to also be taxed more based on where their consumers are located, then maybe that could be opened up. So we'll see. It's an area I think of at least they're willing to engage, but I don't think it's an easy finish line. Let me just go back to one question on vaccines that I can answer quite quickly that someone asked before, and this is on the IP sharing. So I think what's noticeable is there has been a tremendous amount of licensing of the intellectual property behind these vaccines already. So you look at what, you know, take the Indian context, right? So India has a huge pharmaceutical industry. They're going to be producing billions of doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the Novavax vaccine. They've developed their own, which the data is a little bit wonkier on. But so the license agreements have already been happening. I'm just not convinced that the sharing of the IP is really what's the holdup in getting more doses. It's really just that complicated to be. Look at what's happened with AstraZeneca, right? A giant pharmaceutical company, yet convincing regulators in multiple markets that their vaccine is safe and effective and, you know, is actually meeting this data criterion that they have. I mean, this is hard stuff. And I'm not sure we want, you know, mom and pop vaccine maker making vaccines for the world, right? This is really tricky, especially the newest ones too, the Pfizer's, the Moderna's, completely new technology. There's only like 5 people in the whole world that knows how to make those things. It's not easy to share that technology. They'd have to take people off of their production facilities right now that are busy, you know, trying to scale up as quickly as possible, ship them out to other places to teach them how to do it. I mean, I do believe that this stuff is that complicated on the IP side that they're kind of doing as best as they can, and that the IP transfer, at least for the vaccines, isn't really what the crucial bottleneck is at the moment.
Great, thank you. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Christophe?
No, thank you.
Okay, so I think we only have time for one more question. So this question comes from Lauri Tatinen, who is wondering about, who says China and climate questions have shared interfaces, and one of the most important ones is Brazil, whose exports to China are now more than the US plus the EU plus the UK combined. Is it possible to work together for Brussels and Washington in the direction of Brazil? And is this on anyone's agenda? Does anyone want to take that one?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think it's referring to trade relations with Brazil, bringing Brazil into this conversation, because the focus has been on China. So is there some possibility to How will the trade relations with Brazil sort of play out, do you see?
Well, I don't think there's much I can say here. I mean, as we mentioned earlier, the EU has always claimed to be a proponent of multilateral cooperation. And if we talk about a future world where there's a few players that are quite powerful, then Brazil would definitely be one of them. And I think it'd probably be good to focus more on relations with Brazil for that reason.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is Brazil's a complicated story. You know, there's obviously concerns with what's happening in the Amazon and environment, which is going to make it tricky to do the Mercosur agreement with the EU. You know, the pandemic, they're suffering. And, you know, they have made overtures to China, which seems to be willing to give them vaccines, unlike, you know, what the United States is not willing to do, and probably what Europe isn't willing to do at the moment either. And so, you know, when this stuff comes into play, it makes it tricky. But in the broad question, is the U.S. going to change trade policy to deal with, you know, it's probably not high on their agenda of that. That being said, the Brazilians, you know, for kind of the first time, have signaled an openness toward trade. They're not traditionally the most outward-looking country in terms of trade relationships, but they've changed their tune in the last couple of years, and so we'll see how long that lasts.
Great, thanks so much. I think that is all the time that we have for today. We're just 1 minute over time, so not too bad for such an excellent discussion. But before leaving you today, I just want to quickly draw the audience attention to the next lecture we have in the America-Europe Fund Transatlantic Series that will take place on the 6th of April with Professor Jos Delbeke and Professor Nathan Holtman on US-EU cooperation on climate change and the environment. So for all of those of you who had climate change and environment-related questions, please join us next month. And this will be followed by a lecture on the EU and US approach to human rights with Ambassador David Schaefer and Professor Jan Wouters on the 20th of April. And you can find information about these events on America-Europe Fund, which is just one word, .eu. So thank you again, Professor Chad Bown and Professor Christophe Crombez for sharing these insights with us and for this very lively discussion today. And thank you to the audience for joining us as well.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.